Global. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Global Forum, with my great pride, Senator Corker from my home state of Tennessee and AJC's own Alan Rich.
Good to see you.
Do I get a hug? Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, excuse me. Please. Thank you, Bob, and welcome, Senator Corker. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
And I wish I could say Tennessee's my home state. Unfortunately, at this point in time, it's Illinois.
I can see why you say unfortunately, but we'll welcome you anytime. Thank you. So,
thank you.
Just kidding, of course.
I'm going to dive right into questions because your time is dear and our time is dear. But I wanted to remind you about what, the audience, what Bob Ellman just said, is if you have a question for the Senator, and we're going to try to take questions from the audience also, either tweet it to AJC, at AJC Global, or fill out the card that's sitting on your seat, and there will be staff members walking around to pick up those cards. Let me begin. First question, it's almost a natural one, and Bob referred to it, and Bob and I have traveled around the world together, as well as separately, is the issue of America's global leadership. It is fascinating that I have met leaders all over the world, not simply in the Middle East, who have asked the same question continuously. Where is the United States? They're seeking more U.S. leadership, not less. How do you see future U.S. engagement in the world? And then specifically in that regard, in the best tradition of American foreign policy, that domestic partisan politics stop at our shores, what advice would you give our next president, whichever party that person may come from?
Well, there's no question, and you know this well in your current job, that the world is not the place that we would wish for it to be without U.S. leadership. It makes a difference, and that doesn't mean that we have to have boots on the ground in every country in the world. It does mean that we're constantly using every tool that we have to advocate for good things. Soft power, I know, was mentioned by Bob when he was making his introduction, a big part of what we do. I will say that our country has learned a great deal over the last 15 to 20 years. If you really think about what's been happening on the Republican side of the aisle, the Republican side has been really focused and pushed by neoconservatives. And I don't say that pejoratively. I'm just saying it's been a view of the world that if we push democracy all around the world, then the world's issues will end. And I think there's no better audience than this one, and thank you all, by the way, for having me here today. It's a huge privilege. No better audience than this one to say that, look, you can push democracy on countries too quickly and bad things happen. Exhibit A would be Gaza, which was a massive mistake to make that happen in the way that it did, or at least from my opinion, a massive mistake. And so you've had the neoconservative side. And on the Democratic side, you've had the liberal internationalists who believe if every country was a member of an international organization and they met, then all the world's problems would come to an end. And I think where we need to go in U.S. leadership is those both have a tremendous amount of idealism attached to them. Sometimes idealism doesn't exactly work out. We live in a world that is complex, that has many competing interests, and we have sometimes leaders of countries that are not the best in the world, but we need to deal with in an appropriate way. I have been more inspired by the work of Jim Baker and Henry Kissinger towards sort of more of a realism, and I think the next president needs to have a little bit of that. I think some of the mistakes we've made have been generated through some ideology and haven't been steeped enough in maturity. But I do believe that, again, at every level, the United States needs to be engaged around the world, and I would encourage the next president to use every degree of leverage that we have as a nation towards that end. As it relates to the bipartisanship, one of the things I'm most proud of as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is there is nothing that has come out of that committee under my chairmanship that wasn't strongly bipartisan. And to me, issues, our friendship and our relationship with Israel, our relationship with countries around the world, it needs to be done in a bipartisan way. When you get to a place where it's breaking down along partisan lines, you really fraying the strength of the relationships that we have. So I would encourage the next president, the last question you asked in a three-part question, to certainly spend the bulk, a big part of his time, on making sure that the United States is appropriately influencing the rest of the world. The fact is that when problems arise in other places in a global economy and in the type of world that we have today, it ends up affecting our nation. But secondarily, to make sure that in all that you do, you bring the United States Congress along with you. I don't know if y'all remember President Bush 41, when he had the issues of Saddam Hussein going into Kuwait. I think all of you understand that a president can exercise the ability to go into a country under the War Powers Act for a period of time without coming to Congress. They have that ability. If you remember, Sam Nunn was chairman of the Armed Services Committee, a Democrat, and he opposed the United States taking on Saddam Hussein going into Kuwait. The Bush 41, even though he had a staunch, highly respected opponent in the United States Senate, came anyway to Congress, sought their approval, and as you know, one of the few big successes that we've had in a long time, unfortunately, as it relates to kinetic activity. So work with Congress as you move along. Congress more fully represents the American people, and when you bring Congress along, you're bringing the American people along. And when you do that, you've got staying power when bad things happen. And sometimes, let's face it, when you're dealing with things like that, bad things can happen.
You mentioned bipartisanship, and I want to compliment you on that insofar as even with regard to the Iranian nuclear deal process. Both you and AJC ultimately came out against the Iranian nuclear deal. But that said, both you and AJC spent full time looking at the deal, considering it before a knee-jerk reaction. And for that, I compliment you.
Thank you.
And I think that evidenced the ability of the Democratic, senior person on the committee supporting or opposing it also.
Thank you.
Going to Iran, though, we've seen that the Iran stockpile of enriched uranium has decreased and appears to have decreased dramatically. But we've also seen increased belligerency. We've seen new ballistic tests. We've seen no let-up in Iran's human rights violations. Iran is still the biggest state sponsor of terror in the Middle East and perhaps in the world. It has had no change in its warlike language with regard to the United States and Israel. Yet, it seems every day there's a country playing host to visiting Iranian officials.
Right.
Or sending a trade delegation to Iran, as though it's now business as usual with the world's #1 sponsor of terror. Mm-hmm. Several Republican primary contenders said the agreement's there and we must respect it. Others said first day in office they would rip up the agreement. Once again, what would you recommend to the next president?
So let me begin at the beginning of all of that. I think all of us want to see issues like this settled diplomatically. To me, as the negotiations continued, we kept eroding the strength of it every time we would meet. I was appreciative of the fact that unanimously almost the entire United States Senate joined in me in making sure that Congress could play a role. And one thing I want to point out to all of you, and it's something that's holding us up right now. When Congress puts sanctions in place against a country, we understand the role the executive branch plays and understands that they have to act in real time to things that come up. And so we grant a president what's called a national security waiver when we put sanctions in place. That gives them the ability to deal with things in real time when they come up. When the national security waivers were granted by Congress, by the way, we had multiple levels of sanctions, I think you know, that you worked with us on and others worked to put in place through the years. No one ever anticipated that a president would take a national security waiver that was granted to him and go straight to the UN Security Council and waive the sanctions ad infinitum forever, in this case for a minimum of 8 years, without ever coming to Congress. I mean, that was never contemplated. And so right now, as we're working on all of these issues that you just talked about, we're trying to put together a bill that will have at least 67 votes, that will deal with human rights, that will deal with ballistic testing, that will deal with terrorism, that will deal with all of the issues you just brought up. That's actually our sticking point right now. I know, you know, fool me once, phooey on you. I'm not going to let that happen again. And so we're trying to craft a piece of legislation. We have crafted a piece of legislation. The person who did it is in the room in the audience today listening to this. He's on our staff. He's outstanding. But we want to make sure that if we give national security waivers to a president on these issues that you're bringing up, they don't have the ability, again, without coming to Congress first, to enter into an international agreement. And so we know that all of these issues are of concern. I'm hoping we're going to be able to pass a piece of legislation to deal with this. I don't say this to be pejorative. The administration is pushing back against any effort, even though the way the bill is written, it does not touch any of the nuclear sanctions. It doesn't deal with any of the nuclear issues. We're not reimposing sanctions that were taken off for we figured out some new ones, but they are pushing back against it. And, you know, I hope we're going to be able to come to a conclusion, because what's happened, and this is what we said at the time. I wrote an editorial in the Washington Post. I was concerned that the Iran deal would become de facto our Middle East policy. And that is what is happening. We are now unable to push back in these other areas in ways that I deem to be appropriate, and many people on the committee and in the Congress deem to be appropriate. I hope we're going to overcome it. But the fact is that that Iran has become even more belligerent. I mean, when they put on a missile, death to Israel in Hebrew, and when you had John Kerry, again, not to be pejorative, telling us that it was a strict violation of the UN Security Council agreement that implemented the JCPOA, strict violation for them to do the ballistic testing they're doing, and yet we cannot get the UN Security Council to take action because Russia and China are blocking that action. And candidly, I hate to say this, I know you're going to have an EU representative here tonight or tomorrow. The EU quietly is saying to us, saying to members, look, we're really worried that y'all are going to take actions that are going to cause our relationships to fray. In other words, they too, quietly, are wishing for Congress not to be pushing back against these belligerent actions that are taking place. My sense is we will. I mean, one of the things that's been most frustrating is ISA. I mean, that's a basic. The Iran Sanctions Act, as you know, expires at the end of this year. We'd like to extend more than just that. We want to extend sanctions against all these other activities that you referred to. But even the administration is pushing back against an extension of that. And as you know, the way the snapback provisions work at the UN Security Council, there's got to be something to snap back to. So if the Iran Sanctions Act has expired, what is there to snap back to? And of course, the administration will say, well, we can easily implement them ourselves. We just think we're on much stronger footing with Iran if they know the United States Congress has put this in place, and those are the things we're going to snap back to in the event the nuclear deal falls apart.
There's another agreement that's about to expire, and that's the Memorandum of Understanding with Israel. For decades, our strategic partnership with Israel has been a cornerstone of U.S. Middle East policy. We understand that negotiations are getting close to being completed. How would you describe, though, the current state of the U.S.-Israel relationship and alliance? And I want to further that by saying, what obligations do you think that the U.S. has to Israel, and vice versa, what obligations does Israel owe to the United States?
So look, it's the oldest democracy in the Middle East. It's a long-standing alliance and friendship that's only deepened through the years. And in spite of the fact that, relations certainly frayed during the period of time of the Iran nuclear agreement, there's no question that they did. I'd love to say to the audience that, Republicans are much more supportive of, Israel than Democrats are, but that's not true, thankfully. Thankfully, that is not true, okay? It went through a period of time where, there certainly was a trough. I think when this presidential term ends, and we'll have a new president, and not to even really refer so much to the administration, but I still think there's a tenseness that exists there that hasn't existed in the past. I think what you're going to see is a return to the norm. I really do, regardless of who comes out of this cycle. But in Congress, certainly there's bipartisan support for Israel and bipartisan support for the Memorandum of Understanding. There's obviously a negotiation that's underway. Israel is under tremendous security threat, both from next door, but also, the region, especially with Iran. When I met with Bibi last, while he was concerned certainly about the nuclear deal, he's even more concerned about the precision that Iran is developing in their ability to deliver through missiles. Conventional weapons. They are very sophisticated, and they're getting better all the time. So, the obligations that we have certainly are to have a new memorandum. It expires in 2018. I know that there's a couple of sticking points. I, like you, based on the conversations that I've had, my sense is that over the next very short period of time, an announcement is going to be made that an agreement has been put in place. And I think there's a couple of baskets. There's the basket of the standard Memorandum of Understanding, but then there's also the activities that we've had around just creating the missile umbrella to protect Israel from what's happening next door. But I think that's going to come to a conclusion. The calculus for Israel is to wait until the next president comes along. If they feel like that what's happening during these negotiations is not, from their standpoint, as good as it might be. The downside to that is the military leaders and others that depend upon this, as you know, it takes a while to plan, and they'd be waiting until the next year. You're getting very close to the time of implementation again. So my sense is an agreement is going to be reached. I've had multiple conversations about that over the course of the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I think that's going to come to a satisfactory conclusion very soon.
Very good.
And it'll be supported overwhelmingly by Congress. So
very good.
Thank you.
Very good. Alan Rich walked out onto the stage with a dozen questions for you. but I have to share this with, I have to share the questions with the people in the audience, and the first one has come up, so somebody in the audience has asked the question.
You're a pretty old fella to be able to use technology so easily like that. So, yes, so that's pretty.
I came out here liking you. What is the right U.S. foreign policy strategy for combating ISIS and the threat of jihadist terror?
Look, first of all, I think all of you understand that probably better than most audiences, the root cause of what is driving this extremism is going to take decades to overcome. When you have 40% unemployment, you have countries that are governed poorly, when you have the sectarian divides that exist in many of the countries where this is occurring. You go to a country like Egypt, 90 million people, 2.5 million new births each year. 4 years, there'll be 100 million. 700,000 jobs have to be created each year just to keep up with population growth. They need 24,000 classrooms today that they don't have. Their healthcare system is in the dumps. They have terrorism in the Sinai, have tremendous tensions within the country. You look at that, and the root causes of people becoming extremist are there. You have the Wahhabi mentality that's been emanating out of a particular country for many, many years that is causing the Friday prayers to be what they are. And so you've got a combustible situation here. And it's going to take years to overcome that. And so we've got to begin that process of trying to deal with those root causes and encouraging those countries to deal with it. We made some disastrous decisions, I'm sorry, as a nation, back in 2011, from my standpoint. I referred to this on a Sunday morning program yesterday, but the move into Libya was one of the most ill thought out. Again, I go back to some of the idealism that can take place sometimes in foreign policy. That'll be Exhibit A in international policy schools for decades over something being incredibly ill thought out. The precipitous pullout of Iraq, that happened in 2011. And then if you look at the fact that we encouraged the moderate opposition in Syria, told them what we were going to do, and then never did it. We never followed through. We never gave them the tools that they needed. So we, in essence, through our foreign policy, at the executive branch, created a home for ISIS. We created a home for ISIS through the policies that we put in place. Now, to deal with them, which, by the way, I was very much opposed to both of the pullout of Iraq precipitously and the Libya issue, but also very much pushing for us to equip the moderate opposition at a time when it mattered with the tools that they needed. So here we are, and again, it's going to take every level of U.S. government, our Treasury Department dealing obviously with their source of revenues, our abilities to counter through social media and other, just the message they sent out. I think y'all know, again, more than any audience, they are as good as public relations firms in Manhattan with their ability to create. So we've got to counter all of that. But at the same time, we are going to have to be more involved from special operations standpoint and others to really cause other nations to come in behind us to deal with these issues on the ground. I think in Libya now there's 5,000 to 6,000 ISIS members who've gathered around CERT. The numbers in Iraq. We're having tremendous difficulties, as you know, dislodging them. And obviously the issues we have in Syria. But it's going to be a longer-term issue. When I hear these people talk about carpet bombing, I mean, this is urban warfare. And it's going to take tremendous amounts of intelligence, stick-to-itness, and certainly leadership on our part to cause other countries to want to join in on the ground and deal with urban warfare in the manner it's going to have to be dealt with.
I've been told I have time for one more question.
Okay.
And the one more question goes back to the global. We've spent a lot of time on the Middle East and threats that arise out of the Middle East, but we live in a big world. Looking to the future, what regions of the world do you think we should be focusing on?
It's easy to run through. I mean, if you look at the longer term problem, biggest problem for the United States, longer term, it is the issue of how we manage our relationships with China. They are obviously, they see themselves as a rival to us globally. The population is massive, 1.3 billion people. They have internal issues themselves, been very, as you know, pushing out in the South and East China Seas, rewriting history. So over the longer term, that's going to be one of the most important relationships for us to manage. In the midterm, Russia, in what they've done in, of course, eastern Ukraine and Crimea, but what they're threatening in the Baltics and other areas, and what they've done to destabilize Europe, which has been incredible, and to destabilize the alliance that Europe has with itself and with us. You think about Putin had no cards to play back in 2012. In many ways was not, again, to be too pejorative, was kind of a bit player on the world stage. And how he's managed with a few cards, not many, to now find himself in the center of what's happening in Europe, what's happening certainly in Syria and other places. It's been an amazing thing. And by the way, speaks to, in my opinion, a lack of leadership on our part. One of the worst days in U.S. One of the worst days in U.S. foreign policy, one of the worst months, was at the end of August, in the early part of September in 2013, when Bashar Assad crossed the red line, and we did not do what we said we were going to do. It was a 10-hour operation, okay? It was a 10-hour operation, just so everybody understands, planned from the Mediterranean, no boots on the ground, and the fact that we did not take action and literally, well, figuratively, jumped in Putin's lap, that was the turning point. And he saw then what U.S. reactions were going to be. I met with a world leader, I won't mention his name, who told me, he was telling me about Putin one night. We sat and talked till 3 a.m. in the morning in the Middle East, and he was telling me, Corker, I've talked to Putin, and I've asked him, why is he doing all that he's doing? And he said, I get no pushback. There's no price to pay, and it plays so well back home. Why would I not do that? So he is obviously, in what he's doing in the region, a midterm issue. On the short term, between now and the next 10 years, no doubt, the two immediate issues for us is the Iran deal and making sure that they do not get a nuclear weapon, and that they did not further destabilize the region with the additional resources and economic growth that will be coming their way, and obviously the issue of ISIS. I know that time is up, and I thank you so much for letting me be here.
Senator Robert Corker, on behalf of AJC, thank you so much for spending this time with us. And I want to remind everybody that at 6 p.m. tonight, we reconvene for the plenary with EU Foreign Policy Chief Mogherini, U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice, and the Foreign Secretary of Mexico.
If I could, the most important person relative to the Memorandum of Understanding getting completed is Susan Rice. So you should ask her the same question this evening, okay?
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.